Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Analyzing Benevolence, featuring the 2025 James Gunn film iteration of Clark Kent, aka Superman. Now, I just want to get something out of the way. While I enjoyed the movie, and many others enjoyed the movie a ton too, it still is worth stating that this iteration of the character is pretty controversial with some people. So, because of this, as well as just a lack of specific details on other iterations, I'm not going to compare him to other versions of the character, such as his mainstream counterpart, Zack Snyder's Superman, or even the All-Star Superman iteration that he's inspired by. I will, however, make more videos covering Superman in the future, including these iterations that I just mentioned. That will most likely include the Zack Snyder iteration as well, so stay tuned for that. Regardless, I want to start by covering this version of the character, as regardless on how you feel about him, I think he's undeniably a return to form for Superman in a cultural sense, as I personally think that he'll get more people into the character, and hopefully DC Comics as a whole, due to the sheer idealism that he represents within this film. And hopefully, he's a sign for things to come within the DC franchise too. Oh, and also, another note before we go any further in this video is that some of my discussion of this character won't just be on the movie, but also the prequel Junior novel released a bit before the film as well. While I'm not really sure on how canon it is, I still think it'll be helpful in understanding more about Superman and how he came to be. With that out of the way though, let's begin. One of the more important elements of Superman in any iteration of his character are the relationships he has with people around him. The most frequent, of course, being Lois Lane. Now, admittingly, one of the minor complaints I have with this movie is that I did wish we got to see a little bit more of Lois Lane and Clark's relationship. Don't get me wrong, what we did end up seeing was great. However, it's still something I wish we saw a little bit more fleshed out. Regardless though, what we do see is still a pretty accurate picture of how their general relationship works. Clark Kent was raised in an almost very traditional country setting, and was always taught about basic things such as honesty and integrity from a very young age, and generally was raised to possibly be more cautious of his surroundings, while also being friendly to everyone that he meets. Lois Lane, on the other hand, was raised in a big city where she pursued big dreams to prove something of herself, and learned to throw caution to the wind while also having little trust in people she meets. This further is established in the book actually, with Clark Kent coming in to try and check up on her to see if she's okay when interviewing Lex Luthor, and her telling him off for not realizing that she can take care of herself, and that she isn't just some damsel in distress. Because of these differences, the two have a tendency to bounce off each other in a way that both simultaneously complements each other, while also contradicting each other and causing conflict. Such as the scene in which Lois is interviewing Clark as Superman and trying to question the logistical ethics of what he was doing, while Superman is defending the purely emotional morality of the situation, with the scene ending up in a bit of a fight between the two. I do think, however, that the relationship still does work, as Lois Lane is a good way to keep Clark Kent grounded in a more pragmatic and logical way of thinking of things, while Clark is a good way of getting Lois Lane to be more open with others and idealistic of the world around her. So it's a pretty good up and down relationship in that regard. Superman, of course, has other relationships in the movie, one of the most notable ones being Krypto. Superman himself describes his relationship with Krypto as a seeming foster situation, as his actual owner, Supergirl, is often out partying and getting drunk, and thus doesn't have much time or discipline to actually take care of him. Because of this, Krypto is not very well trained, and has a tendency to get into places he's not supposed to, pounce people with little regard, and chew on things that were not meant to be chewed on. Even with all of that though, Krypto going missing is one of the few things in the movie to genuinely enrage Superman, as he still cares deeply about him, and doesn't want anything bad to happen to Krypto, not just because he belongs to his cousin, but because he fundamentally believes that he deserves the best life he can live. Then, of course, there's the other relationships in the movie. Clark Kent seems to have a more casual relationship with Jimmy Olsen due to the two joking at the Daily Planet. Superman has a complicated relationship with the Justice Gang, seemingly only being friends with Mr. Terrific, with the other two just being acquaintances at best. There's also the fourth member of the Justice Gang, being Metamorpho, or Element Man as the movie refers to him as, who Superman seems to have respect for, or at least sympathy for, due to the imprisonment that he went through as well as his son. Then there's Malik, another acquaintance of Superman who he's actually had dinner with before, and who Lex Luthor even decided to use as a hostage against Superman, who he ended up actually mourning over and even remembering his name, despite the fact that they've only met like once or twice, with Clark Kent even writing an article about him around the end of the movie in remembrance of him. showing that he cares about everyone that he saves, and those who he can't. Then of course there are his parental figures. While there's obviously his adoptive parents in Kansas and his biological parents on Krypton, who we'll get to later, I also like to think that the robots in the Fortress of Solitude are something akin to parental roles for Superman as well. While 4 claims that they don't actually have any form of consciousness to speak of, this is clearly untrue, as it's shown that they have a significant amount of care for Superman throughout the movie, such as 12 getting flustered when Clark looks at her, and 4 apologizing to Superman for failing him and calling him his friend. This is interesting too because it's kind of a continuation of a theme from Creature Commandos, being AI who follow their purpose in programming, but still gain a bit of compassion and love for those around them along the way. Out of all of these relationships, one thing that is important to note is that Superman doesn't hate anyone throughout the movie, except maybe Lex Luthor. However, part of him by the end still wished for him to try and embrace being human again, and wanted to see him be better than he currently is. So overall, no matter who people are, or no matter how close he is to them, he still finds ways to love everyone and see the best in them that he can. Speaking of which, in one scene, Superman saves a squirrel. That's it. There's no real reason for it to happen in the plot. There isn't some way that the squirrel comes back to help him, and there isn't even really a way for him to be recognized for this either. He just saves it, for no pragmatic reason. And I think that is a great embodiment of who Superman is in this movie. Because while it's been a joke forever that a lot of the time superheroes can cause collateral damage, and Superman does still cause some collateral damage, like the scene in which he digs under the sidewalk, he oftentimes goes out of his way to prevent it as much as possible, such as in the novel when he is careful about the historic cannons in the park being used, or when he actively goes out of his way to try and avoid buildings being hit by monsters, especially if they are filled with people in them. There's also right after the scene when he is freed from the interdimensional prison, where despite being poisoned with kryptonite and being told he needs to rest for a few days, his first instinct is to go back and save the rest of them, or like how in the beginning of the book, he just let multiple people in and out of the Daily Planet building, letting himself be soaked in the rain, or the other scene where he just plans on not killing the kaiju monster out of a desire to study it and possibly tame it, or how he just helps his parents in the book move the cows around. Like I previously stated in the last section, Superman is someone who cares deeply about people, and he shows that care not just by fighting giant monsters, not just by stopping time rifts in space, but by doing actions that are almost seen as lesser and borderline small and meaningless by people such as the Justice Gang. That's not to say that the Justice Gang aren't also heroes, however they more so value the protection of humanity as a concept and as a whole, rather than individuals. And that's what Superman is there for. Now, I've been praising Superman as a perfect hero for the last few minutes, which I feel is a pretty obvious statement to make, especially due to the recent trend of Superman being glamorized as heroic by people, such as with the Starman edits and everything. However, I don't think this Superman is completely flawless either, or at least you can argue it as such, as there is one thing that I think Superman has that can be considered the closest thing to his flaw. Admittingly, calling this a flaw could definitely be seen as a stretch, and this may be the most controversial part of the video, but I still do think that it's worth noting for the sake of discussion and possible nuance within his character. I think something that's somewhat present about this Superman is that he has somewhat of an ego and a semi-fraudulent element to his character. Now, let me explain that. When I say this, I'm not referring to something on the same level as Lex Luthor, Homelander, or hell, even smaller cases like Guy Gardner in the movie. I mean this from the perspective of it being a pretty natural place for him to end up due to someone like him in his position and power. When living in a big city like Metropolis, a place that is the capital where some of the biggest tech corporations of the world such as Luthor Corp, Lord Tech, and Holt Industries, it's going to be extremely expensive just to pay for even the crappiest apartment with a leaking pipe and molding walls there. So, obviously you're going to need to pay rent somehow. With Clark Kent, this way is through the industry of journalism, which, of course, is how he always goes about in practically every iteration of the character. However, the way that he goes about this job is pretty unique. In the book, it's stated that there were 2 reasons why Clark Kent was able to get his job. The first was that Perry White was almost admired by the sheer audacity to just barge into his office and ask for a job with some experience in Smallville and nothing else, not even an interview or anything, And the second reason is that he gave him a shot due to this, and Clark decided to take it by investigating Lex Luthor's attack on the toy factory, with him coming back with an article on Superman's defense of the factory and what exactly occurred, with testimony from witnesses and a supposed interview with Superman as well, before anyone was even allowed on the crime scene at the time. Now, this isn't completely unique to Clark Kent, as this is also a common tactic used by Peter Parker, for example. However, the difference is that Peter Parker is a guy who uses barely credited photographs of himself for a newspaper that talks complete trash about him, while he also gets degraded personally by his boss just to pay for apartments that look like complete garbage that he can barely afford. Clark Kent is an industry-respected news reporter who has gotten the front page of the paper at least 2 times due to his reports on Superman, while also living comfortably. However, all of this is extremely justifiable, as he still is a person who needs to go out of their way to live human life, someone who needs to make a name for themselves besides just being some John Doe, and likely someone who needs to financially support his mom and pa back home who are just living on a farm. Not to mention, you could just argue that Superman does do the work of saving the day and protecting innocent lives constantly, so why would it be a big deal if he got a little extra credit for the work on the site as well? That's why I say you can argue that this isn't even really a problem, as for all the reasons I just listed, it's really not at all bad. However, this is also something that Lois Lane does bring up as a concern, about the arguable ethics on doing this, and pretending to interview yourself for what is arguably his own benefit. Which brings me to his possible ego. Again, this isn't me saying that he's like some deranged narcissist, but I do think an ego is slightly there. One moment that I think highlights this well is when Superman says that Superman doesn't take selfies. This is a sort of catchphrase that he's been thinking of, with Lois Lane of course joking that he's referring to himself in the third person. Lois Lane does also point out to him that he's been getting defensive throughout the interview, and that he has a tendency to avoid conflict if there's anything he doesn't like coming towards his way, and being obviously offended by the super shit comments. So, obviously, Superman at least has somewhat of a desire to be liked, while also having a tiny bit of an ego behind it as well. Now, of course, besides what I previously mentioned about him just being a person who wants to pay rent, and also just the factor that Superman being liked by the general populace and world is very much a positive for humanity as a whole, from a pragmatic lens, you're probably wondering, in response to both of these points, okay, so? And honestly, no, yeah, that's a completely valid response. My reasoning for bringing up these points isn't a claim that Superman is like, literally Homelander, oh my god! Or that this is a deconstruction of his character, or that James Gunn failed to adapt him properly, or even that this version is more flawed than Superman in general. These are none of my points. My point is simply mentioning something that some people can possibly try and argue as a flaw, even if I don't really consider them flaws as much myself, because it adds nuance to the discussion when talking about him as a character. It's important when analyzing characters to try and see it from every angle rather than just a purely biased one. So, do I think Clark Kent is a fraud? Do I think he needs to be held accountable for his actions? Sent to the fandom character discourse hell where they argue that he's literally the worst person ever and should die? No, I don't. I just thought it was a really interesting part of his character that I noticed and was worth noting. But, with that tangent out of the way, let's get to something a little more concrete about him. To call nature versus nurture a controversial topic in psychology is like saying that being burned alive feels pretty hot. While most people agree with the sentiment that there's a little bit of both, with some things loosely defining you based on a genetic level, while other things are determined based on your environment and how you're raised, the exact of what affects what exactly and how much can be changed by your environment is still very debatable. Why I bring this up is because how much of Superman's personality is due to him being raised by the Kents, versus him literally being from a different species, is kind of an interesting question. The two pairs of parents are extremely different. The Kents worked merely as a guide for Clark, and supported him simply by providing him tools for his life, and have chosen to live their life in a simple manner by just living on a farm in a small town with only a basic grasp of modern technology. The L's are much more ambitious and elitist in their own personal goals, seeing Earthlings as weak and simple creatures who need reconditioning and to be taken over, and seeing themselves as superior beings. The one thing they do have in common is their love for Clark. However, even then, this is debatable due to the El family arguably just seeing Kal-El as an extension of themselves and their personal goals. Regardless, these two pairs of parents undeniably affect Clark Kent's ideology and how he sees the world. The Kents affected him in a nurture sense, likely giving him an open mind to other people and to value things such as honesty and hard work, due to them living on a farm as well as just what is revealed about their personality in general. The Els affected Clark in a more nature sense, and to a much lesser degree a nurture sense. As well, Kal-El is much different from his parents in his general philosophy and the way he sees the world, suggesting that the core ideals of the Kryptons are more so based on culture rather than differences in genetics and species. It's still likely that he adapted their traits such as their sort of grandiose way of viewing things, as well as the possible sense of altruism, albeit in a much less corrupted and genuine form in Clark's case. It's also possible that Ultraman is a pure look at how Kal-El would act if not for his nurture, and only in his nature. A big, brutish idiot who only knows how to take orders and not make his own decisions. It is just as likely that this view of him is false, however, as Lex did say that he was an imperfect clone. But I think it's still true that Ultraman at the very least represents what Superman fears on becoming. Someone who blindly follows evil without considering how it would affect others, which we'll get more into that point later. Back to the Els though. In terms of how they affected him from a nurture standpoint, their message they left alongside him had a profound impact on him as a person, with Clark believing that what the message was trying to say was that he was sent to Earth specifically to protect his people there, and that it was his life's mission. Of course, this interpretation turned out to be false, and as previously mentioned, the mission was actually to conquer Earth. This proceeds to put Clark into a crisis, as he soon realizes that everything he thought that his purpose was ended up being a lie. However, like John Kent says, this kind of ends up saying more about Clark with how he ended up interpreting what little the message was there to begin with, and how good he is, rather than simply making him out to be a monster. This is likely to do again with the way that the Kents raised him, as they were raising him to be an upstanding citizen regardless, so the Clark's interpretation of the message was simply just an extension of this idea. In the end though, what's important to note is that despite me talking about his parental figures and how they influenced him, he isn't just an extension of them, as he still has his own unique experiences outside of them that define who he is, and no matter what sort of cryptic alien message says, he's still, at his core, good. Which brings me to my final point, what Superman represents as a whole. I stated before that I wouldn't compare this Superman's ideals to other versions. However, there is one exception I want to make to this rule. One of the most iconic taglines related to Superman is the saying that he fights for
truth and justice in the American way.
As this has evolved, this has taken on a new meaning more and more, especially due to how America is sort of seen nowadays. And hell, even in the clip from the 1978 movie that I just showed you, Lois Lane also makes a joke on it.
You're gonna end up fighting every elected official in this country.
Now, this, if you can't tell, is when the video gets pretty damn political. So, when I say that his flaws section might be the most controversial, I was wrong, as this is probably going to be the most controversial, but I want to share my piece of it anyway. Let me make this perfectly clear. I don't think there's anything wrong with being patriotic, or being proud of being American. However, the reason the term the American way has since sort of faded in the background is because what the term American way even is has corrupted over time. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't pretty damn left-leaning. But I think even without this bias in mind, I think everyone agrees that there is something wrong with this country as it is right now. Of course, we can go over the small details of people disagreeing with what those specific flaws and issues are with the country. However, I think there's one thing that both sides can agree on, at least to some degree. And it's the issue of corruption of politicians and the elite. Now, I'm not going to get into real-world examples of this, as this isn't my place to educate others on that. If you want to do that, go to any other YouTube channel. There's a lot of, pretty much everyone's talking about to some degree. But I will go over examples that are prevalent in the current DC movie universe, as even if it is fiction, it's still adding more to the point that it's trying to make. Task Force X, a group of convicts who are forced against their will to fight for the United States government, and if not against their will, then very heavily coerced to do so. Project Starfish, an experiment secretly conducted by the United States government in a separate country in order to test the capabilities of an intergalactic being while simultaneously torturing it and any of the test subjects they used for it. Task Force M, what is essentially Task Force X. However, instead of using ordinary humans, because of the information of it being exposed to the public, they use monsters as a way to dodge the ramifications of this, which includes 2 falsely prosecuted individuals who have gone through horrible trauma, and Lex Luthor, a man who was able to gain so much power and wealth that he was able to directly influence and impact overseas wars, coerce the United States government, open an interdimensional prison where he locks up his own ex-girlfriends, and almost conquer his own country, all just for the sheer pettiness and spite towards a single man. Even if we aren't concerned with how the real United States acts and influences politics, whether you're looking at it from a liberal or conservative standpoint, within the DC universe, or rather this version of it at least, the United States is insanely corrupt. Now, again, I want to be clear, whether it be based on the real or fictional interpretation of the United States, having a superhero represent the ideals of it isn't a bad thing either, such as Captain America. Though I believe what makes characters like that truly timeless are moments of doubt that they have towards the modern government of the US, or even just general hesitation related to some decisions they make. Superman still does kind of represent this idea in the movie, as he does seem to have some trust in America in the process of the system due to turning himself in the movie. However, much like Captain America, he doesn't fight solely for his country, as shown in one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, where he's arguing with Lois about whether it was a good idea to go and stop the war being done by Baravia without consulting the President or Secretary of Defense. And you can argue with the ramifications of a hypothetical event like this all you want, but in the end, Superman had one reason for it, and one reason alone. People were going to die. He didn't do it because he wanted power, or fame, or even to be a representative of the United States. He did it to save people, and to represent the embodiment of himself and good, as sort of an idea that, regardless where we came from, who raised us, and even where we are now, it isn't any of those factors that strictly define us, but our actions and what we do to help others. So, with that out of the way, who is Superman? He's a man who was born to intergalactic warlords, however raised by farmers to be respectful and caring to all living beings. And because of this upbringing, he interpreted the message from his parents as a sign to be hero to everyone, and continued to do so for 3 years under this belief. And even when he found out that all of this was just a lie, he still persevered, stronger than before and more determined, realizing that no matter where he came from, no matter what mistakes he makes, he is who he is. He's still good, and will still strive to do the right thing, because in the end, he's human. If you're still here, thank you for watching to the end of this video, and, well, obviously I need to mention the obvious. Thank you a million to Vile Eye for shouting out the channel, and also just giving me advice and support on the side as well. And also, thank you to everyone who's new to the channel as well. Like, it's over 500 subscribers right now. Fucking hell, it's weird when I really think about it, but it's, yeah, no, like, thank you to everyone who's decided to check out my channel, given support, given suggestions. I love seeing suggestions, I genuinely do. It's really fun to find out new characters and see what people are interested in. But, I don't know, that's me rambling. Maybe I might do a ramble video about that at some point. But also, huge shout out to Only Carlos, who is the first patron on this channel, which, you know, fair enough. It's only like $1, like level tier, but even then, it's still like someone actually decided to support me on Patreon. It's kind of crazy. But thank you, Only Carlos. And if you want to get a shout out like that, then feel free to support my Patreon. There will also be benefits from it, such as getting a special role on Discord, possibly getting a Patreon exclusive chat, but you know, that's going to be if we have enough people in there. An ability to vote for one of next month's videos. However, with September, I just decided to do that as a public poll, which you can actually check out in my posts. So go vote for that if you want to see something interesting in September. But for October, there is going to be a poll that you can decide on what video you'd like. Probably going to do that after the next poll. But yeah. And also, again, thank you to everyone. If you want to talk to me or just other people in the community, please check out the server. And also, one last thing. there's a thunderstorm. That's what that is. That's what that is. I'm living in the mid fucking west, so yeah. And whatever. I wanted to say, check out Effigy's channel. He's also been a pretty cool guy. We're not his channel, his Twitch. I'm an idiot. But I want to do shoutouts like this in the future. So get prepared for that. I will probably do that in the future. Shout out people that I like, shout out channels that not as popular, or just friends of mine who do cool things. So yeah, anyway, that's enough rambling. And if you made it this far too, I really appreciate it, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.